Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at aggregate supply and starting to make a link between some of the factors impacting aggregate supply and how that relates with aggregate demand. So the aggregate supply curve will always look like this. We'll always have a horizontal section followed by basically a curved or intermediate section and then a vertical section where the line goes directly up. So every time you draw an aggregate supply curve it should look like that. Aggregate supply is the total annual quantity of all finished goods and services produced within the Australian economy. So, one, aggregate demand is all about the level of demand for Australian goods and services. Aggregate supply is the total annual quantity of all finished goods and services produced. So, basically, I mean, they might not be exactly the same. For example, we may have, a lot of demand and we may have stockpiled production from previous years, and therefore we're able to meet that aggregate demand with supply from the past. But aggregate supply is a measure of the total quantity of finished goods produced within Australia within that year. Okay, what happens if we have too much demand but not supply? We have inflation. Okay, Australia's sustainable rate of economic growth is limited by our access to natural labour and capital resources. If we can't develop these resources so that we can produce more, we're just going to get inflation when we demand too much. Okay, so aggregate supply is vitally important to improving the efficiency with which we use our resources and therefore promoting our long-term sustainable growth. So aggregate supply is all about sustainable growth. It's all about long-term growth, and it's all about being able to basically produce to meet that extra consumption. Having the production available to meet the added consumption. So why is aggregate supply important? Well, it increases the level of supply to match aggregate demand without inflationary pressures. So if I was to draw a little graph here, and we've got demand and supply, I know it's not a normal supply diagram, just a micro one, but if demand was to shift to the right, okay, we know that we're going to have higher prices, like it would be there, but if we can push supply to the right as well, we can keep prices the same and boost our real GDP, which is always the x-axis, without having significantly higher prices. So boosting our long-term real GDP is important and is only achievable if we're able to meet extra aggregate demand with extra aggregate supply. Ultimately, it helps to improve the productive capacity of our economy. It removes bottlenecks, and a lot of people say, what's a bottleneck? Well, bottlenecks is referring to things like traffic jams, or if we have a lot of demand for our exports, but our ports, the infrastructure in our ports isn't good enough to achieve the level of demand. Or for an individual business, it would be if there's a lot of demand for that product, but they don't have enough labour resources, or they don't have significant capital or good enough machines to produce that level of output. So a bottleneck's just like a jam or a traffic jam or something preventing us from meeting that extra demand. The same with capacity constraints. Aggregate supply is critically important for preventing stagflation, which is basically when an economy experiences high inflation and low levels of economic growth. And we'll talk about that in the future. So what boosts our aggregate supply? What are some things that are going to boost our long-term productive capacity? Well, it basically comes into three separate categories. One, if we can improve the quantity and quality of our resources, or the availability of resources. So that would be if we discover new minerals, if we have really good climatic conditions, so for example if we have really good harvest and we're able to produce more. Increased labour force participation, so immigration, we get more women into the workforce, if older people are staying in the workforce for longer. That was kind of the idea with the baby bonus. It's kind of the idea with increasing our immigration numbers. That's the idea behind trying to get women back into the workforce. Things like the childcare subsidies, all of that is to try and get people, improve the quantity and quality of our labour resources. Aggregate supply can also be affected by costs of production. So when wages are cheaper, businesses are more willing to supply. Okay, it's all about willingness and ability to supply. These ones are mainly about ability because we've got more resources. This is about willingness. So we can keep wage costs down, and we'll talk about real unit labour costs in the next chapter. If we have a low minimum wage, businesses will have higher profit margins and be more willing to supply. I thought that one was a smudge on my screen, but it's clearly not because you can probably see it. Sorry about that. And the exchange rate, we'll talk about how that's a supply side factor, but it also, anything that affects businesses' costs of production is a supply side factor. And then there are things that are affecting the efficiency and productivity of businesses. So we have advances in technology. Like a technology breakthrough in the farming industry is going to allow us to supply more. If we have less workers on strike, we have more access to labour. If we become more productive, that is the main way we boost our long-term supply. Productivity is the most important thing to boosting our long-term supply. So having smarter workforce, better technology, anything that's going to allow us to become more productive. So shifts in aggregate supply Shifts in aggregate supply are the main determinant of a nation's long-term productive capacity. We need to shift supply out or we can't grow in the long term. China's been able to grow because they're getting smarter, they're getting better access to technology, better infrastructure, and they've got lots and lots of people, but that's growing as well. More favourable supply side conditions will allow us to boost our supply curve to the right and allow for long-term sustainable growth. So for example, this is 3 aggregate supply curves, this is your middle one. Okay. Anything that's going to boost aggregate supply in the long term is going to shift it this way, and basically if we have aggregate demand going down like this, it allows us to meet that extra aggregate demand. So say aggregate demand went from 1 to 2, we're able to meet that with extra supply and not have excessive inflation. So rather than going from prices going from here to here, prices will only go to this point here because we were able to meet that extra demand with extra supply. So the important thing is the long-term ability to supply, our long-term productive capacity, our long-term real GDP is all dependent on our ability to supply in the long term. Okay? Demand becomes useless if we can't meet it with extra supply because we're just going to get really big prices. Don't know what all that yellow stuff is. Okay, so some things that will shift our supply curve. These are not demand side factors. These are things that are going to shift the supply curve to the right. And again, we'll talk about these properly in Chapter 5. But things like productivity, low minimum wages, less strikes, more access to resources, lower real unit labour costs, increased participation, better climatic conditions. Aggregate demand will generally increase when these things occur, but that's because it's basically going to be caused by a movement along the demand curve. So if we kept demand stagnant, I probably need to do a different graph for this one, but let's say we stayed on this demand curve here, when supply shifts to the right, the demand curve will go that way. Okay, it'll be an expansion in demand because of the lower prices, make us more competitive, people demand more because things are cheaper. So a shift in the supply curve to the right will cause a movement along the demand curve to the right, a movement that way along the demand curve is what I'm getting at. Really bad graph. Thanks for listening.